Hello, I'm Ellen Minard, owner of Ellen's Half Pint Farm, specializing in hand-painted yarns and fibers, and I travel around the United States doing dyeing workshops. Today I want to talk a little bit about hand-painted yarns and how you can, when you go and look at those skeins, how you can figure out what the color is going to look like in your final garment. Now you can decide how it's going to come out, how it's going to look, and because often what you see is not what you're going to get in your final garment. So I would like to show you a few skeins, show you how the colors have been applied to those skeins, and show you the resulting garment so you can see how the colors look in that garment. Often when you go to shows, you see all these beautiful skeins of hand-painted yarn hanging up, and you look at it and you wonder, how is that going to come out when I end up knitting with it? So many dyers will show their yarns just as it comes out of the dye pot. They will have, you'll see beautiful sections of yellow, red, blue, all these different sections. But when you knit up your final garment, it's not going to look anything like this. You're not going to have a sweater that's going to have big sections of yellow, big sections of blue, big sections of green. It's not going to look at all like this. A lot of dyers, and this is how I choose to do mine, is I reskein my yarn before I hang it up at a show so you can see more like what the actual garment is going to look like. And this is the same yarn. I dyed these two together in the same dye batch, the same yarn, but I have reskeined this so that you can see how the colors are a little more redistributed. I did this with different length skein when I reskeined it, so it sort of redistributes the color, and this is more like what your final garment is going to look like. You're not going to have these big sections of color. And if you look at the two colors side by side, this one definitely looks a lot more intense. The colors are a lot more saturated because you're seeing a whole section of yellow. Whereas in here, you're seeing smaller amounts of yellow throughout the entire garment. So all of the colors look a lot more vibrant and more saturated in here than they look or will look in your final garment. Now, I'll show you the final garment in a second. I'll show you the final garment now. This is what it's going to look like for the final garment. You can see how all of the colors, yes, you see little sections of some of the colors, but also you see it looking more like the skein that's been reskeined because the colors are all redistributed and blended. One of the disadvantages of looking at a skein that's been reskeined is that you don't actually get to see how the colors have been placed on the skein. And that's really important when you think about how the final garment is going to look. The very first dyeing workshop I took many years ago, she had us lay our skein out, put a ruler above the skein, and do exactly 4-inch sections, right straight down, all the way down. Now, fortunately, I don't still have the skein, and I don't even think I knit it up because I knew how it was going to end up. It was going to end up with stacking, pooling. It was not going to look like the colors were flowing well on the garment. They were really going to look like little separate sections. So when you purchase your yarn like this, when it's not been reskeined, you can actually see the edges. You can see how the colors flow in the skein, and this gives you an idea of how the colors are going to flow in your final garment. When I do my dyeing, I tend to vary the edges. So when I go from the red to the orange, you can see how there is not a straight line. Some areas there's more red. Some areas, like over here, there's a lot more orange. I vary it so that you can really see that it's not a straight line, and this way you're not going to get pooling, you're not going to get stacking or striping. The other thing you can see is how long of a section of color there is. When I dye, this is my rainbow colorway, and when I dye colors that have both dark and light in it, I make sure I do a little less of the light. Your eye is attracted to the light, so that you're going to see more of those light colors. So I always make sure that I have more of the darker colors in the skein like this, unless of course I'm trying to do a really light and bright skein, and then obviously I'm going to have a lot more lighter colors. But if you can see in this skein, there's a smaller section of yellow versus blue. I have a longer section of blue, a longer section of green, because that way your eye will, even though it's attracted to the yellow, you will see a little more evenly the colors in the finished garment. So when you go to a shop or when you go to a show and you see yarn that has been reskeined already, That's a little bit of a disadvantage. You can't actually look at the edges. You can't actually see the length of each color. But if you're in a yarn booth at a fiber festival, you can ask the dyer there how they dye it, ask them how they place the colors and how they distribute the colors on the yarn. If you go into a yarn shop, it's a little bit more difficult because the yarn shop owner doesn't always know exactly how it's been dyed, but you can still take that skein and you can look at it very carefully. If it's been twisted up really well, you don't want to be taking apart someone's skein of yarn, but very carefully, you can look at it and you can actually pull out the colors in that skein and you can see the different lengths. So if you take two sections of the orange, and you can see here how I have a lot more yellow in this one than I do in this one. So you know that when this has been dyed, that hasn't been an exactly straight line. It's been dyed variated along the edges so that the colors are not all exactly straight. So that's one way of dyeing. That's my variegated dyeing. Another way that I dye is I do what I call my pansy colorways. When you look at a field of pansies, you see lots of little bits of color. So rather than doing these sections of colors that are anywhere from 2 inches to 12 inches long, I do it in little tiny bits. This is the same colorway, but I've actually dyed this in little bits. This one is not reskeined so that you can see how it comes out sort of in the regular, how I've placed the dyes on here. But this one is the same color as that other rainbow. It's just done in the pansy colorway so that it actually looks a lot more muted because you have smaller sections of colors and you have little bits. You might have a ½ an inch, you might have 2 or 3 inches of the color, but they all vary throughout the entire skein. So when you do a pansy colorway or little bits of colorway, the garment looks very, very different. This is a garment that has been knit using the pansy colorway. You can see in here where there are lots of little bits. This really makes the color flow. It redistributes it. There's no chance of pooling, stacking, striping when you dye in the pansy colorway. So those are a couple of different colorways that I do. A little tidbit on that, one of the advantages of reskeining, one of the reasons why I reskein, besides so that you can see how the final garment is going to look, the colors are going to look. I also reskein mine because I want to make sure it's really nice and neat and organized. And just a little tidbit on when you do buy yarn like this, if you go, I have reorganized all of mine when they go out for sale. And if you go and you run your finger along the loop like this, you can actually see that it's all organized and nice and neat. And if you have one strand that is flipped over, when you go to rewind this, you're going to end up with a mess. So make sure when you do go to rewind your yarn that you make sure that you can really fit your finger all the way around and you don't have anything tangled up. So let me show you one more example of a variegated. This one actually has been reskeined. This is how I show it in the shows. This is Purple Mountain Majesty, and you can see all of the colors in here, and that one's actually slightly more vibrant than the one that we used in the sweater, but it's the same colorway. And you can see again how the colors flow throughout this garment. There's not stacking, there's not pooling. You might get a little section here and there of pooling, but very, very little. They really flow throughout the garment because I've varied the edges. Some of the colors are shorter, some of the colors are longer sections, but they're quite varied so that it flows really well. So another way of dyeing is speckled. A lot of people are doing speckled dyeing, and that is completely different, a lot of fun, and that actually is one way of dyeing, of placing colors on the yarn so that will look very much like the garment. Your skein and your garment will look very, very similar. Here is, and obviously it's not the same colors, but here is a skein of speckled yarn. You can see how there are lots of little bits of colors in here, and here's the finished garment knit out of that. So you can see, again, that there's little tiny bits here. It really looks very similar. Another way that I dye is tonal dyeing, one color. When you buy commercial yarn that has been dyed as a one color, it's very solid. It's one solid color throughout. One of the advantages of buying a tonal yarn or a one color yarn from a hand painter is that I tend to paint that yarn, whether it is one color, whether it's a lot of colors, I still paint the dyes onto the yarn rather than doing it in a solid pot. So you still get slight, subtle variation. I don't have a skein here with me, but I do have a couple of garments that have been knit out of my one color. You can see in here there's one color, but if you look carefully, it looks like there's depth to this. That's because it's very, very slight changes in color throughout this garment. Very, very subtle. So it just gives it a little more depth. And here's another example. This is a red one. You can see a little bit more in this one, a little bit more of the color variation, a little bit more of the depth through here. So those are the way that I do hand-painted yarn. Another thing that I do is yarn blanks. And if you haven't worked with one of those, they're a lot of fun to work with. I'll show you some samples of those and show you what the finished garment looks like. Because in a yarn blank, very often what you see is not what you get. So if you haven't worked with yarn blanks before, they're a lot of fun to work with. They sometimes will come out looking very, very much, your garment very much like what it looks like on the yarn blank, but often it looks quite different. So first I want to show you some different things you can do with yarn blanks. You know you can knit socks with them, but you can also do shawls and scarves and hats with them. This one, and I don't have the actual yarn blank because we've actually knit the yarn blank up. So this is one that we dyed, and I dyed a little bit of a gradient from a purple to a pink to a purple, and we did a scarf. And the scarf really looks very, very similar to the yarn blank. You see the colors gradually changing from purple to pink and back to purple. The same thing with the shawl. We did a gradient from a black to a red and back to a black, and the garment looks very much like the blank. It goes from black slowly changing to red and then back to a black. The next one we did a yarn blank, just a gradient from a light to a dark, and then we knit a shawl out of that, but we also changed up a little bit how the colors came through to vary it. We knit from one end and from the other end and met in the middle down at the bottom. Now that's a fun way to work with a yarn blank. You can also knit, this one is actually a double, those were all single yarn blanks. This one is actually a double yarn blank. So we just knit right from the doubled up blank and we knit a hat. So this way, if you prefer knitting with a heavier weight yarn, you can knit. But again, you see that the colors come out very similar to what they look like on the blank. And the last thing we did, other than socks, which I will show you next, is we knit this blank. We knit from each end, but we did a brioche pattern so that we really changed up the way that the colors come out in the final garment. You can also do that with skeins of hand-painted yarn. You can change up so much how those skeins look. That is, you can do a linen stitch, you can do a slip stitch, you can do a knit one below, change the number of stitches that you add or decrease or add on a few stitches if your pattern allows it. That changes up the way the colors come out, but that's another whole segment for another video that a lot of people have covered. So now I'll show you some of the double yarn blanks and how we did socks out of that. And that is very, very different looking in the final sock than the blank itself. Okay, so now we have some double yarn blanks that we've knit into socks, and I want to show you what it looks like. This first one, we knit stripes going up and down on the blank itself, and these are the socks. They really stripe going around, and that's from this one. The next one, we did sort of a speckled, but it's a speckled over color in the background. And this is how they came out. Quite different than what they look like in the blank. The next one is the one that surprised me the most. We did a little bit of a patterning in the yarn blank, and this is how the socks came out. Really, they don't look at all like the blank itself, but it's kind of a fun way to do that. And then the last one, we did bigger sections of colors, and it did come out fairly similar to what it looks like in the yarn blank. The last two that I want to show you, one is a speckled, which looks very much like it does in the skein. And then the last one you see all these beautiful blanks that people have done designs on. They do sunsets, they do scenery, they do writing on it, and it's really fun to work with those, but you are not going to get any of that in your finished product. So let me show you the speckled one, and let me show you the one that I actually did attempted to. I'm not an artist, I'm a dyer. I attempted to do pictures of some sheep and goats on the top of it, and I'll show you what the socks look like. So the last two, speckled and speckled, really looks very similar to what you see in the yarn blank and what you see in the final pair of socks. But the very last one is my attempt at doing sheep and goats, which, like I said, is not very good. And I only did the top of the blank because I knew that I was not going to get sheep and goats on my final product. There's the sheep and goats. They're gone completely. It's just little sections of color. So even though it's really fun to buy yarn blanks that have been done as a scenery, as a design, you're not going to get that in your final product. I thank you very much for joining me. I hope this answered a few of your questions, but I certainly didn't cover all of it. And if you have more questions, please do email me. You can reach me at my website, www.ellenshalfpintfarm.com. You can reach me there. My email address is there. You are welcome to email at any time. Ask me any questions you want about the dyeing or about working with the colors. And I hope to see you soon at a show. Thank you.